The following episode of the Comics and Crypto podcast is for informational purposes only, and anything expressed by the hosts or their guests is solely their opinion. This podcast does not constitute financial advice, and anyone wishing to invest should seek their own independent financial or professional help. Have fun and enjoy the show.
Hi, I'm Sean O'Hare, and I know comics.
Hi, I'm Spencer Vogel, and I know crypto.
Hi, I'm Kevin Lee Loader, and I don't know shit. This is the Comics and Crypto podcast.
Comics and crypto, crypto and comics, collector's world in a digital age. Comics and crypto, crypto and comics, it's where the next billionaires will be rich. It's comics and crypto.
Ash, hey! Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hello, good afternoon. How are you?
What's going on?
Nice to see you guys.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today. I've been really excited to talk to you. And congratulations. So you just started working with Goldin Auctions.
Yeah, back in September. Yeah, they
Nice.
acquired our company, and my former business partner, Sean Goodrich, and I are now running the comics vertical for Goldin.
That's amazing.
What was your previous business that got acquired?
It was called sellmycomicbooks.com. Essentially, what it was a marketing, well, it still is, because they own it now, but it is a marketing, content marketing site. So it creates leads for people who are interested in either selling or at least getting their comic books valued.
Cool.
And so the stuff that we want to acquire, we make offers on. And now we have Goldin, we can also offer consignment. So that is a big difference maker for us.
That's incredible. And you've been involved in the comic book market for quite some time?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been interested in comic books since I was a kid, but I started the business in 2012. One of the things that I realized when I was researching the market was that dealers had been doing business the same way for a really long time. They were behaving as if the internet didn't exist. The really advanced ones were listing stuff on eBay. I knew that I was into a market that was underdeveloped from a technology standpoint, because when you go to a dealer that did have a website, and not all of them did, and they would be smart enough to link to their eBay listings, they didn't even have the savvy to use an affiliate link to their eBay listings. So when whoever landed on their site and clicks on, let's go see my eBay listing, they didn't know that you could get commission as well if someone buys something by following your links. Simple as that. Like that simple thing, like maybe realize, wow, okay, I've got a big advantage here. I don't know how long that advantage is going to last for, but I'm going to make the most of it. And so we started off by offering free appraisals, and we were doing that. We were the only ones who didn't set up at shows. We just were purely online. And so now if you go to Google and search for free comic appraisal, you'll find there are a bunch of people doing the same thing, but we were the first.
That's awesome. And I love that you brought that up, the importance of accessibility. That's something I'm definitely going to dive into a little bit later. But before we do that, I want to get more of your background in comic books. I know that you mentioned that you were a collector as a kid, so very much similar to myself, but do you consider yourself an investor in this space now? More of an investor than a collector, or kind of a combination of the both?
Wow. During the pandemic, I became an investor. But even then, I checked off a bunch of my Grail boxes, so it wasn't just a question of what's going to go up in value. I mean, I spend my whole working day doing that. So as a distraction from the pandemic, that wasn't a very good one. So, for example, like I always loved Fantastic Four. It was the first comic books I ever read as a kid. And so I just wanted to get a run of Fantastic Four in high grade. So I started putting that together. My number one was a 5.5. And the problem with having a hobby that's also your business is it's hard to separate the two. So at the same time as I was doing that, I was thinking to myself, watching the prices going up and thinking to myself, wow, I should cash out, because I bought this in 2020 and it's already increased by 50% in 2021. And it's hard to separate those two things. So I needed a second part of the hobby that wasn't about money. Well, I'll get back to that, but it's really not about money. So because the business was literally people send their lists in, we make an offer on the keys, everything else gets shipped. All kinds of weird stuff comes in those boxes, right? There's odds and ends. Like almost every collector has all their stuff laid out, and then there's one box at the back. There's like 8 books that they don't know what to do with because they just don't fit, and they're usually foreign or weird editions or reprints or whatever. And so I just said to the shipping guy, when you receive collections and you find these weird books, just shove them in a box for me, and I'll buy them from the business. I'll buy them from the business. And so I started a collection of overseas comics, which are fascinating. There really isn't much information about them, and it's very hard to price them because we don't know. Is the Thai edition of Batman 423 a rare book, or are there millions of them? We have no idea, but it's cool to get one. It's the Todd McFarlane cover, but with a heart on the front, with Thai language in it. And when I went on comics.org, the Grand Comics database, to see what these are, how old they are, or whatever, there wasn't even a listing for it. So I created one, and that's one of the ways I like to give back to the hobby. It's when I find something that's new or unknown or whatever, try and update the Grand Comics database with that information, show a scan of it, and so people now can look it up. So I have quite an extensive collection of foreign comics, which are weird and wonderful.
What are some of your favorites outside of the 423?
Well, I collect British price variants first and foremost. I love the Silver Age and Bronze Age British price variants. The Silver Age, actually, there's not that much information about them, but they're identical to the US editions apart from the cover. And there is speculation that they were printed before the US editions because of the time it took to ship. Like, we didn't have the mass shipping lanes and stuff that we do now, the sort of container ships that we take for granted now. We didn't have that. It was much more difficult to ship something from the States to Europe. It took months. And so the UK price variants of Silver Age books have no month in the slug. They just have the issue number. And then they have a British price. And some of them have British ads, and it's just like, this is so cool. They are pretty rare. In England, we don't have basements. We have attics, and things get put in the attic. When you don't know where to keep something, you shove it in a box and you shove it in the attic. And they are not insulated above. They're insulated. So if you imagine like a steepled roof like this, the insulation gets put on the floor of that space. So when you go into the attic, the insulation is underneath you. So anything that's stored in the attic is exposed to a lot of temperature fluctuation. And of course, if there's any moisture or whatever, there's, so high grade British Silver Age comics are extremely scarce. If you look at the census on any key issue, any Marvel mega key issue, it's insane. It's 1 or 2% of the total census are UK. Sometimes even less. Like, I think AF15, there's like 45 or something that are certified British price variants compared to 5,000 certified US ones. And it's like that across the board. Hulk 1 is extremely rare for a UK price variant. And so I started collecting them because I was like, well, they come in anyway. They come into the office almost for free, like they're in the collection. Nobody really wants them because people in the US don't know what they are and they don't value them as highly. That's the other thing. They're really rare, but they're undervalued compared to the US editions. And so I'm like, this is a no-brainer. One day someone's going to figure out these are actually should be more valuable than the US editions, not less. So yeah, so there's that. So what you asked me was, what's my favorite book apart from the Batman 423? I've got some Norwegian Tom and Jerry comics, and they're
Cool.
still in.
Cool.
You hear this all the time from people who don't know what comics are. They're still in the plastic. Well, these are still in the plastic, and somebody in Norway thought it would be a really good idea to sell children a comic book that also had like a toy hammer. And so, when you see Tom trying to hit Jerry with a hammer, let's provide a hammer so that you can hit your sister or brother with it. I mean, that's a great idea, right? I've got those. They're kind of fun. I have all kinds of weird reprints of Silver Age DC were actually sold in the Pacific Islands with a special panel printed on the front cover, Pacific Islands edition, in a different currency. I also have some Australian stuff, the Newton stuff, that was unofficial reprints of the Marvel Silver Age stuff. They just printed them and didn't tell them they were doing it. And some of those had stickers in the middle, and those are worth more if the stickers are intact and stuff. It's a huge minefield, and no one really knows what they're doing because it's all brand new, and CGC don't provide a lot of information on their website about it.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, because like in the U.S., I mean, like we've seen a lot of popularity with the Canadian price variants here, and you see those sell for a premium. And
Yeah.
yeah, so I mean, I don't know, Sean, have you heard about these British price variants before? This is the first time I'm really hearing
Yeah,
about them.
yeah, I've seen actually some German as well for like Fantastic Four 1, but they don't sell for very high prices. I mean, I've seen some on eBay in the past, and they a few $100s for a Fantastic Four 1 German edition, and it's raw. Yeah, like you mentioned, Spencer, Canadian price variants, they're pretty well sought after.
I think some of the reprints, the European reprints, are much later. So the German Hulk 181 is from the 90s.
That's a
So
good point.
as you know,
That makes
the later
sense.
books were looked after and bought in quantities by people who thought they'd be worth a lot of money one day, and so they aren't as worth as much for that reason, because they're much later. But some collectors like to put together. They'll choose one key issue and they'll try and buy the versions from all the different countries. Like there's an Australian New Mutants 98 that's very expensive. And of course, now the newsstand variants are picking up in popularity.
Yep.
The theory being that those were put on newsstands, they weren't just sent to comic book stores in boxes, which is kind of strange because we had a comic book store in Maine until quite recently. And quite often the stuff that came from Diamond wasn't 9/8 shape when you opened the box. Like they were often quite badly damaged. They will probably be like 9092, brand new in the box before you even put it on a newsstand.
Wow.
So newsstand variants are considered to be about as rare, like 1 or 2% of the population. But the interesting part about Canadian price variants is that they were sold in the US. There are a few US cities that are geographically more northern than Canadian cities. So those what they call border cities, the ones
Actually, like Buffalo, maybe.
Yeah, I was thinking of I'm trying to think now. Minneapolis is another one I think that is more northern than most of the Canadian cities, and they had Detroit maybe as well. They had distribution of those Canadian price variants in those cities. Yeah, if you started there, you could just say, okay, pick an 80s key like I don't know, Secret Wars 8, and so you've got the Canadian price variant, you've got the newsstand variant. And then there's definitely a German one of those. I've seen those around, and there must be others. I mean, there must be foreign editions of that, and you could just say, okay, I'm going to pick Spidey keys from the 80s and just try and get one of each. I mean, and then you get all the cover swipe stuff and the variants, and I'm like, yeah, the hobby is suddenly branching out. It used to be very simple, and now it's got quite complicated. And it's a fascinating time to be a comic book collector, investor, dealer, whatever you want to call yourself.
What are some of like the dream comic books that you don't currently own that you'd like to have in your collection?
Oh boy, definitely anything with Batman pre-Robin. So all the detectives from 27 up were pretty much, yeah. I mean, actually, Goldin, the first month I joined, they had a Detective 2765 Universal in the auction the month I joined, and although I was part of Goldin at that point, I still felt like I'm an outsider pressing my face against the window of a candy store, going, "Oh my god, I wish I could afford that. I wish I could afford that. Like, can we renegotiate the deal to buy my company for another couple of million so you can give me the Detective 27?" Yeah, it's sold for 1.74 million, which it seems like a lot of money, but actually, I think in 10 years' time, that's going to seem like a real deal.
Yeah,
I think Detective 27 is so rarely offered on the market that it's always going to be a fantasy for me. I think unless something crazy happens and I win the lottery or something. So there's that. I'm not a big Superman fan, so I've never really hankered after owning an Action One. But then there are some other things I'd love to own. Some of the Mile High Pedigree stuff, just to say they own it. The more you see those sell, the more you see those sell, the more you realize that how exceptional that was. And actually, I spent a lot of my early years in the industry reading Chuck Rosanski's blog, where he describes how he found the collection and the research he did on the previous owner, who was in a care home at the time, I think, Edgar Church, who then subsequently died, and how bitter his family were about the whole thing, and how they just wanted the comics out of there. And he paid, I think, 9 cents a book for them. The good stuff was in a closet, and the later stuff was kind of stacked on the floor. And I watched quite a few of those storage locker people who like randomly buy storage lockers and then empty them and find all this treasure. And it's typically that the earlier stuff is at the back, and as the person gets older and more frail, they can't organize it as well, so it just gets like thrown in. So that the later stuff was stacked in the middle of the floor of the basement at a church's house, and they said, you got to get all this out of the way first. So his truck would only fit half the comics in the first run, and he didn't sleep for the entire week. They said, you can't come back till next Saturday. And so he imagined in his head, like, oh, they're going to call somebody else, or they're just going to throw them all away, and because all the good stuff was in the closet, but he couldn't get to it in time. He had to like load his truck up. It was snowy outside. He had them loaded into banana boxes. You imagine, and we still know there's like 9.4, 9.6, 9.8 have come out of that collection, like almost typically. So imagine now, like, it's crazy. They weren't bagged and bought. I mean, it's just nuts. That collection was just nuts. And so just to say that I own, I don't know, it wouldn't. There's all this talk about that Wonder Woman 1 has vanished from that collection. No one knows where that is, because in the early days he couldn't afford to keep them. He had to liquidate some, and the only way he could think of selling them was to advertise in comic books. The industry wasn't like it is now. It wasn't an organized industry. There weren't really conventions, and it was very small, very small. So he said, okay, well, if I can advertise in every Marvel comic that's published every month, I'll sell all this stuff over time. But to finance that, he had to sell a lot of the best stuff for cash quickly. And so there's guys who own all the really high end Batman 1 and it's like, and the Captain America 1 had to be sold. Anyway, so fast forward, and it's fast forward, and lots of people in the industry would make fun of him because it's like, oh, you sold all this stuff too quickly. You're an idiot for not keeping it, and this, that, and you're so lucky. Of course, you're a successful dealer because this landed in your lap. And so he's dealing with that. And then I think in the late 80s, his accountant was also his bookkeeper, and she'd been embezzling money from his business. And he discovered this, and the company would have folded. So he had to sell the Action 1 to 10 that he'd been keeping back for himself. I think he got like 80 grand for them or something. And then, subsequently someone's offered him $1 million for this book. And then there's rumor that that's color touched. I mean, it's just this is one collection. And so I became fascinated by pedigrees. And pedigrees seem to be less frequent, but the Promise collection that came up in the last like 18 months or so shows there probably still are pedigree collections out there. But we're just going to see less and less of them over time, I think, because more and more people are now educated about what comic books are worth.
That Batman 1 that sold for the 9.4 that sold for 2.2 million back in 2021. I think that could be one of the best deals. Man,
that's another book that I was like this, like I really want to Batman 1. Yeah, it feels like the business is always one step ahead of me. I remember the do you know there's a Batman 1, the Larson Batman 1 that's an 8.0 because it's got foxing on it. That was turned into I don't think they call them NFTs, but they're like a fractional ownership thing where you can buy pieces. Yeah. So that was on the market for 800,000 in 2018, and at the time that was the highest grade Batman 1 that was for sale. And I looked at it and was like, how many kidneys do I need? I mean, I probably just
let's see. I have this many kids. They have this many kidneys.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's logarithmic. That's smart. I didn't even think of that. I was thinking like, if I could possibly buy it. And by the time I was looking at all my investments and everything else I could possibly sell, thinking maybe, and then someone bought it, and then it was back on the market for, I think, 1.4 million about 6 months later. And then it went for 1.8 million a couple of months after that. And like, I've missed that boat as well. Yeah. But that Batman 194, that Batman 1 is definitely on the list of books I would love to own.
One of one.
Yeah, I've got some pretty cool books. I've got a Hulk 1. Hulk was always one of my favorite characters. I've got Crime Suspense 22, which I think is one of the best pre-code horror books with the
those
severed
covers
head.
Are insane. Oh, those covers are insane.
Yeah. I know.
Oh man.
I know. It's like, you can see why the Seduction of the Innocent thing was so it landed perfectly at the right time. But it's still crazy to think that in the US there were book burnings. Like, just think about that for a second. Like, never mind the censorship thing, but the fact that some guy, some German guy, let's face it, like said, oh yes, you should stop your children from reading all these books, they're corrupting them, and let's organize book burnings and big bonfires and throw all these comic books on there because they're corrupting your children, right? And people fell for that. Like, that's, yeah, we've come a long way, I hope.
Back in 2017, I think 17 or 16, I had a chance to get a Fantastic Four 1 5.0 for around 7,000. I think it was around $7,000, and I had to liquidate most of my collection to do it, and I chickened out. And that was my dream comic to own. It didn't happen, and man, that the all-time high for that one, for that grade, I think it was around $52,000. I think like in 2021, and it's come back down to about 25 now. But man, what a regret on my end. Do you have any comics, any stories like that for yourself? Are there any comics that you passed up on that you wish you? Oh, the PTSD is sinking in.
way too many. No, I where do I start? So when I was first collecting comics, and I mean, when I say first collecting comics, not as a young child, but as a young man, like as a teenager, a friend of mine at work got me back into comic books, and I started going to the UK conventions, which were not very frequent and not many of them, but I went once in a while. I remember a Fantastic Four 1 on the wall. I can't tell you if it was a US or a UK one, but it was £800, which is about, I don't know, $1,500, something like that at the time, which was 1990. That was quite a lot of money. Yeah. And while I could have afforded it, I was like, I had that collector mindset, which I think is something that maybe your audience should be careful of. I published an article called The Amazing Spider Math. And so I took the ASM1 and I got rid of the word man and put math there. And I said, if you stop thinking like a collector and start thinking like, not an investor exactly, but think about the financial impact of your choices on your collection. Let's not call it an investment. Let's just say you're a collector. Simple as that. You want a run of Spider-Man from 1 to, let's say, 300. Well, you should buy the number 1 first, even if you have to finance it. Because by the time you filled 2 long boxes with the other issues and you get to like number 50 and you start working backwards, all the stuff from number 1 up would have appreciated so much that it's going to cost you 3 times as much to own it, by which time you probably can't even justify it. I mean, you talk about the FF1 prices. I mean, that was an undervalued book for sure. Spider-Man 1 has never really been undervalued, like, relative to FF1. But back when I wrote that article, a 6.0 was about 10 grand. And I think those things peaked at 30, 35, and maybe they've come down a bit since then. But so if you just followed my advice and borrowed the 10 grand at, say, 4%, paid it off over 3 years, and then started adding 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and gone the other way around, instead of sticking the cheap stuff at the back of a box and working forwards, you'd be quids in, because your collection would be worth 3 times as much, and you'd have done the hard bit first. It's like I don't know, it's like any job. Like, you go to work and there's always this one thing that on your desk that you really can't face, and the longer you leave it, the more difficult it gets. Like, there's this horrible phone call you have to make, or to a client or something, or this paperwork you just don't like to do. And it just gets heavier and heavier in your mind the longer you leave it. Well, it's kind of like that. The longer you leave it to buy that number 1 issue, the worse it's going to be when you actually come to do it, the more it's going to hurt. And I think that's kind of like a lesson for life too. But yeah, I did buy the Fantastic Four number 1 that I dreamed of in 2020, but I flipped it for 10K profit in 2021. And I kind of look back on that and go, that was kind of like, I sold out a little bit there. But yes. So that FF1 from 1990, that's one that stays with me. But Sean and I, back when we started working together, Sean Goodrich and I, we in 2015, we were literally living month to month. So we'd buy a collection, let's say it was 30 grand, and then it would cost us another 10 in fees to just get it certified. So that's 40 grand that's tied up. So all those books have gone to CGC, and the big keys come back the fastest, of course, but we need our money out, because by then we have another collection on our desk that we want to buy for another 30, 40, 50, 60 grand. The only place to get that money is from the keys that have already come back. So at one point we got ahead of ourselves, and we got momentum, and you get to the point where instead of oh my God, you just like checking the mailbox to get the keys back every day because you need to sell them to finance stuff. You actually got a bit of money behind you and you've got momentum. So you've got economy or value tier books coming back from a year ago every week that are kind of like great, gravy on collections that you bought a year ago, and they're financing the next deal instead of you just like living hand to mouth. And so I said to him, well, do we really need to sell these big keys? Like, can we keep some of them? And I said it'd be like a sort of like a 401k. And so we bought this giant fireproof safe, like something from a Wild West movie with a big wheel on it. And we called it the Vault. And so once in a while, when we could afford to, we would keep 1 or 2 keys from a collection and put them in the vault, and we keep a spreadsheet to sort of like see where we're at with our investments. So we have a Superman 1 that's a 1.5 that was horribly restored when we bought it. It was part of a collection in Minneapolis, and the rest of the collection was certified. This one was not, presumably because someone either bought it restored in a holder and just cracked it because it was a really bad copy, or just never bothered to get it certified because it had paint on it. Like some kid had got a brush and painted on it. And I said to Sean, like, we paid 20 grand for it, knowing it was restored. And we said to the owner, look, we'll set this one aside. We'll do a deal for everything else. And then we'll talk about that last book at the end. And here are comps for restored copies of Superman 1 in this condition. That at the time, I think was about 30,000. I said, we'll give you 70% of retail, which was 20 grand roughly. Then we sent it off to get the restoration removed. And we were pretty confident it was going to be possible because it was just paint. We couldn't see any trimming or any pieces out or anything. It was just someone had just painted it. I was like, for sure someone can remove that, right? So it got a universal 1.5, but it looked like worms. It looked like worms had eaten the cover. Like, I guess that's why the kid painted over it, because I guess insects got to it or something. There were like these weird like tracks through the cover. It's kind of a little ugly looking 1.5. But now that thing is worth, I don't know, $200,000+.
Absolutely. Wow. I mean, a 0.5 restored recently sold for close to 100, I think 80 to 100. There's a private sale.
Right.
But that's incredible. Wow. That's awesome. 1.5. Wow.
Yeah. And we also we just sold up, we had an All-American 16 first Green Lantern, also 1.5. Most of our Golden Age keys ended up being 1.5, 1.820. I think we have a Detective 35. So to answer your original question, yes, there's plenty of books we've let go that I wish I had back, but we stopped the rot by having our little vault of books. And so, I think we have 5 AF-15s and 4 ASM-1s, and, we have a Journey 83 and a Hulk 1 and 2 or 3 Hulk 181s. And like, we didn't sell everything is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. Chuck Rosansky would have done the same if, he had the vision to realize that one day these Mile High books are going to be worth millions. I'm sure he would have done exactly the same, but you can't. You can only be wise in hindsight. And I'll answer that question slightly different, because it ends up being we end up talking about money as a dealer. You always end up talking about money. So we got an Action 7, a Pop Dillinger. Do you know about the story? Pop Hollinger, not Dillinger. Pop Hollinger was this dime store owner. And kids, for some reason, would take their books to him, and he would preserve them by removing the staples, gluing brown paper to the edges of the comics so the edges wouldn't get damaged, and then sewing them closed. And so they're called rebuilds, Pop Hollinger rebuilds. And they come up quite often. Like once in a while, you see one that has like this weird like strip of like a ½ inch of brown paper down the right-hand edge. Sometimes they have the staples, sometimes they don't. Anyway, so we bought a collection in Canada, which most of the keys were like that. They had this brown stuff on. We didn't know what they were at the time. And the Action 7 got all that removed and got a 2.0 universal. I wish we hadn't sold that, because that's kind of like the poor man's Action 1. Second Superman cover. It's a very cool cover too. Like he's kind of hovering over Metropolis, I guess. And yeah, no, that's a really cool book. I wish we still had, not because of the value, just because it's cool. What else? There are a bunch. Like I would say all the EC pre-code horror stuff. you know, like we didn't need the money that badly. We never had high grade ones, but I think holding a collection of those would be really, really cool. What have we sold? I've got a collection of Scooby-Doo comics.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, no, I think some of the stuff that's undervalued, that gets a bit overlooked, things like the first appearance of the Flintstones, which is Del Giant 48, I think. Things like that, Top Cat #1, weird stuff like Barbie and Ken #1, and things that people associate with their childhood beyond comics.
Yeah,
I think are undervalued still in this market. And so I like to collect that. I've got, the Scooby-Doo. I've got almost a full run of the original Gold Key Scooby-Doo. We bought that by accident. That came in a collection. It was like, honestly, you look at the Marvel, you look at the DC, you scan for other stuff, and then you overlook things like the Gold Key because they're usually not worth anything. And there was a full run of Scooby-Doo in this collection of gold, came in, and we got them basically for free. And I bought them from Sean, and yeah, they've done pretty well. I think Scooby-Doo 1 is now like 10 grand in 9.2 or 9.4 or something.
Wow.
There are also you know about the price variance, the test market price variance, 30 and 35 cent Marvel ones.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah, so there's actually the Scooby-Doo 1 test variant. Only one has ever sold on the open market, and it was a 1.0, and it sold for I think $1,000 or something crazy because they're just so rare. Those test variants, apart from Star Wars, are which are also rare, but there are many more. For some reason, there are many more of those. I think because Star Wars was such a cultural phenomenon that people kept those comics more frequently, maybe. But like a Flintstones 1 or a Scooby-Doo 1.
Eternals 1 is another example. Eternals 1, like a 35 cent variant.
Eternals 1 is a 30-cent variant. Yeah, but those 30-cent variants aren't as valuable because they're more common. They show up more often, and I think partly because they look different, right? So people say, "Oh, that's got like a starburst on the front cover instead of a circle or a square. What's that?" So people remember that. They're like, "Oh, that looks different," and it really does. And so the 35-cent ones look exactly like the 30-cent ones, except they have a 5 instead of a 0. Sean's got a philosophy about collecting, which is buy something or collect something that you don't see often enough, so it's a challenge to find it. But when you do find it, you can afford it. Because what's the point really of me saying, "Oh, I want to have a Detective 27"? Well, join the queue of people that want a Detective 27, and I won't go to afford one even if one does show up. So it's a bit pointless to want one of those. But Scooby-Doo 1990s price variant will probably cost me $5 if I ever find it. There's the thrill of the chase, but it's not going to bankrupt me when I do find it. There's some cool books. I mean, we've bought some amazing Golden Age collections of crime and horror, and I wish we kept some of those because you just don't see them very often. Toby Press stuff from 1952, and yeah, it's just rare.
So are there any other comics or collectibles that are going on auction soon on Goldin that you'd like to highlight, just for our audience in case you want to promote them, or just like any news about the company you'd like to share? Really, just any final thoughts?
Yeah, there's a couple. We have the first Elite comic sale that Sean Goodrich and I are responsible for putting together launches on Valentine's Day, which a lot of love to go around. We have some pretty incredible books in there. There's a Captain America 1. Almost all the Silver Age keys are represented there in nice grades. X-Men 1, FF1, AF15. You could literally round off a whole Grail collection on that one sale. But also, we like to mix it up, so we've got some high grade Bronze Age stuff like that. So while they may not be worth the earth, they're not worth anywhere near as much as an AF15. It's hard to find those Marvel 20 centers in really high grade. They're really tough. So we consider those books to be elite worthy. But if you go to goldin.co and look at the auction, actually I can say .com now because we just bought the .com. So you can go to goldin.com.
Oh,
you'll
nice.
find the comic auction. Yeah,
somebody made some good money on that.
Excited about this. So this is it's so new that it's so new. I keep forgetting to say that. I don't need to say goldin.co anymore. It's goldin.com. So you can go to goldin.com and check out the Elite auction. And there's I think a few dozen really amazing books in there. So I wouldn't want to highlight anyone in particular. But personally, I think a Cap 1 is a grail for most people, just to own the first appearance of Captain America. It's got such an iconic cover. That's very cool. I would like to talk about one service that we've just launched, which is so new that it's not even on the website yet. and it's called Pressing with Goldin. If you're a collector or even a dealer who has acquired some books, they need to be pressed before they're graded. Currently, you're looking at a turnaround time in the market of several months, like 6 to 8 months, just to get them pressed. But you have to pay for the service on day one. So you're paying for the pressing and grading on day one, and you could be looking at up to 2 years to get your books in your hands. That's a lot of money to lay out that far in advance. So Pressing with Goldin, we will turn around your book in 7 days. It'll be pressed within 7 business days by our staff. We've been pressing for years. We're experts at it. We will charge you zero upfront for the pressing and the grading. So if you are a dealer, let's say you're a dealer, like we used to have the same problem. As I told you earlier, when Sean and I started out, we'd have money in a collection and we couldn't afford to buy the next collection because the money was tied up in the grading fees and the pressing fees. So if you're a dealer, this makes a big difference. You could have $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 extra cash in your pocket if you use Pressing with Goldin, because you aren't waiting a year to get that money back. You don't need to spend any of it because you don't pay anything until the item's sold by Goldin. So it frees up a lot of cash flow for dealers and even collectors. Like, it can be a big difference. Like, some people can go, I'd love to have my ASM 300 pressed and graded. I just can't afford it. Well, as long as you're prepared to sell it with Goldin, we'll do all that for you for free up front. So it all gets paid at the back end. So that's a new service, and I'm really excited about that. Everyone I've spoken to about it is excited about it. So Pressing with Goldin is going to be a thing.
Yeah, it's been a blast to see the collectible space grow over the past just couple of years, and especially with the community that we connect with the VEVE community. A lot of them started with digital collectibles first, and now they're getting more involved in the physical space, which is really exciting to see.